Some of my favourite PC memories have been with Chieftech cases, which is why when I found them hiding away from all the other companies at Computex 2024 with their brand new $65 BX mesh, I knew I had to get my hands on it. Let's take a look at the best cheap MATX case that you've never heard of. It's seeking time. Let's start off with panel removal on the BX mesh. There's two thumb screws on the rear of the case. You need to remove these to remove the top of the case first, because the access for the whole case comes from the top, well, at least to begin with. So you loosen those and then you slide this panel back. It needs a bit of force to pop it back, and then you can do the thing, you know what I'm gonna say, lift it away from the case. To get into the rest of the case, you need to remove 4 screws up top to remove these side panels. The thing that I noticed with the BX mesh is it probably doesn't need to have these screws in there at all. In fact, it probably doesn't need to have the screws in there for the top panel because everything is just so tight and well fitted, which means this case could technically be toolless if you wanted it to be to get entry. Once you've pulled out those screws, you can lift those panels straight up and you know the rest, away from the case. Taking a bit of a closer look at the panels themselves, this is a mesh side panel and it's consistent with what we've seen other mesh panels from other case manufacturers. It's very porous and probably will be great for airflow, but it's hard to say right now. The rear panel is a solid panel, so there is no mesh and no airflow whatsoever, which is okay. This is pretty typical for these kind of cases. Lastly, that top panel is a plastic top panel and it's got a mesh dust filter built into it, so it should be quite easy to clean. This plastic section on the front panel can also be removed via 2 screws, but there's also a dust filter integrated into that as well. It would have been nice to see this with a clip and no screw at the top and the bottom to make this easier to remove to clean, but you know, it is what it is. This removable side panel will allow you to install 2 2.5-inch SSDs. There's also another 2.5-inch SSD mount on the side of the case, as well as mounting for either another 2.5-inch drive or a 3.5-inch spinning rush drive. For power supply support, the BX mesh supports power supplies up to a maximum length of 180 millimeters. There are a couple caveats, and that's mainly to do with graphics card support. Now, if you use a really long power supply, then you're limiting your maximum graphics card length, which we'll come back to in a moment. Because the BX mesh is designed pretty similarly to a regular small form factor case, it has an extension cable for the power supply because the power supply is in the front of the case, with the other end of that extension cable being on the back of the case. It's got a single pre-installed 120mm PWM fan. And look at that, I got the logo to be the right way up. That's kind of random. For fan and radiator support on the BX mesh, on the bottom, you can do 3 120mm fans in all configurations. You can do 2 140mm fans, however, you can only do that if you're using an ITX board. Caveats, 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 ladies and gents. That's what happens when the cases get smaller. However, I think you might get lucky and be able to do it anyway, but we're not going to find out today on this episode of Why Didn't You Do the Thing That We Wanted You to Do. Up top, we can do 2 120mm fans, or you can do 2 140mm fans, or you could do a 240mm radiator or liquid cooler. The reason why you can't do a 280 is people tend to forget that radiators have end tanks and it makes it longer. Just because it could technically fit doesn't mean it will fit. The end tanks on a 280mm liquid cooler or radiator will probably touch the power supply. However, caveats, 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 if you were to use an SFX power supply, you could probably make it fit. But we're not going to find out on this episode of You Never Do Anything Fun, Nick, with your host, Nick. Finally, on the rear, a 120mm fan. That's the compatibility because look, there's already a pre-installed fan. Let's see if we get lucky again. Let's see if it stops. Oh, come on, come on, come on. Nah, see, doesn't strike twice. Lightning never does, unless it does. for motherboard support. The BX Mesh supports motherboards from ITX up to MATX, and you can see that we've got this MATX Gigabyte board installed in here. Well, it's not really installed because it has a center peg and that is holding the board in place. So I don't need to screw it in right now. Another thing of note is the motherboard tray appears to be a little bit sunken because it has a cable routing raceway at the top of the motherboard tray. If you're looking at installing an air cooler in the BX Mesh, you're looking at a maximum cooler height of 165 millimeters. For GPU support, you're looking at a maximum supported length of 380 millimeters with some caveats. That's right, ladies and gents. If you have a power supply installed up the front that exceeds the maximum length, let's say you have a 180 millimeter power supply for some reason, you are reducing that to 300 mils. But you know what we're gonna do? We're gonna see how big we can go. For case wiring, we've got our USB cable. This is also for USB Type-C. We'll come to that in a moment. We've got the front panel audio connector, as well as all of these little connectors. See them right here for all your lights and all your switches. On the front panel, we've got a power button with a combined power light, a combined headphone and microphone jack, a USB Type-C port that uses that USB Type-A connector, and a USB Type-A. Now, the keen-eyed and very clever ladles and gentle sandwiches would have noticed that the Chieftech logo is on an angle. It's for a reason, because I hate logos on the front of cases, and this is just stuck on, so I'm unsticking it, and I'll clean that up so there's no logo. I'll come back to why this is important later. The funny thing about making YouTube videos about cases all the time is you can kind of expect to know what people are going to say in the comments. The first comment will be, this looks like the Cooler Master NR200P. You're right. It's a little bit taller, but it's very close to the same dimensions. And the other comment is going to be something like, hey, this looks like a Jonesbow case or the Asus AP201. I kind of will agree with that, but this is smaller than both of those cases. So let's do our usual thing. Let's do a build, find out what all the interesting stuff is. We'll test the thermals, and then I'll let you guys know if this is worth whatever price I said it was worth at the start of the video. All right, ladies and gentle sandwiches, let's take a look at the thermals. What you're seeing with the thermals for the BX Mesh is the thermals are quite good. In fact, they're basically the same with the panels on and off, which just goes to show that the airflow focused design of the mesh version of this case is very, very good. It's hard to say what that would be like if we were to have the TG version of the case, but I wanted to see what a bigger version of the NR200P mesh from Cooler Master would look like, and this is very, very interesting. One thing to note is when thermal testing with the bottom filter off, we had much better GPU thermals by about 2 or 3 degrees on average. And that is something that we typically do see with cases like this with the filters on the bottom. There is no filter at the top, so yeah. I think Chieftech's design for the BX Mesh in terms of thermal performance is pretty darn good. And if you want to know what all of the hardware was in this build, there's a PC part picker list down below and little cards on the screen, and we go through the build section of the video to show you what it all is. But what do I think about the Chieftech BX Mesh now that we have it here after seeing it at Computex? Well, to be honest, like I say with a whole bunch of these other cases, it's really difficult to tell what something is going to be like when you see it on the show floor, because it's a loud environment, there's a lot going on, and you're not really taking heaps of time to investigate what the deal is with the case. And I'm happy to report that my instincts with seeing this on the show floor were right. The build quality is a lot better than I thought it was. Like I said, it's really hard to tell when something's right there, but having it here now, it is a lot better than I expected it to be. For $65 US, the BX Mesh is looking quite competitive, especially when you compare it to things like the NR200P from Cooler Master. First of all, you're getting that MATX support in a similar footprint. You are missing out on 280mm liquid cooler support up the top, but to be honest, when you use CPUs like the 7800X3D like we did in this system, because that's kind of what you'd be going towards if you're doing a high performance system, for gaming especially, 240mm is all you're ever going to need for a CPU like this. Very, very well executed case. And for me personally, I love Chieftech cases. Well, more specifically, I love Chieftech cases from 20 years ago. And much like we're seeing with Antec, I would love to see Chieftech make a bit of a comeback, because next to Antec on the podium of the best cases back in the day was Chieftech standing right next to them, which is why I was surprised that when we went to Computex, they weren't in the main exhibition hall with all the rest of the case vendors. They were on the other side with more of the obscure devices and all that kind of stuff. And it was good to see them having something to show us at Computex. And it was good to see. Like, I'm actually very, very, very excited for more cases from Chieftech, but I do have some feedback. First of all, this is something I spoke to Chieftech about at Computex. That logo on the front has to go. It just doesn't look good. If it was just a triangle, it would look really, really cool. Also, this front panel is a little bit strange. It's kind of like what we saw with the Lian Li A3 MATX with that plastic panel. Another bit of feedback I've got for Chieftech is a case like this, especially with the way it's built, I don't think it needs any case screws to get in whatsoever. It's got 6 panel screws altogether. I think they can be removed. This panel is very, very tight on top. So to get in, like, it requires a little bit of force. And if anything, this panel up the top locks these other side panels into place. I think them getting rid of the screws and leaning more into a toolless design could be a pretty interesting concept for something like, let's say, a BX2 mesh. As for the cable management in the BX Mesh, it's similar to the cable management that we saw with the A3 MATX from Lian Li, to the point where I was almost convinced they were using the same motherboard tray. I did look into it and I did compare the case with photos and video that we have already shot of the A3 MATX, and they're not similar, but they do have some similar concepts. On the A3 MATX, they're on the inside, so on the motherboard side of the motherboard tray, whereas on this, it's on the back side. That's what kind of threw me off a little bit. As well as that, with the motherboard in this case, it's a little bit more recessed, which is something that I like. But again, when you recess a motherboard into the chassis itself, You do lose a bit of the cable management behind the motherboard tray, but again, that's the point of having that bit above the motherboard to run all the cables like the EPS power cable. So I would say that they thought of all of those little things with this case, which is, I don't know if it's surprising, because this is the first Chieftech case that we've reviewed on the channel. So it's hard for me to make a mental benchmark of what they've been doing, because we've not touched any of their cases. Well, we've not touched any of their cases in the last 20 years, put it that way. 20 years and me having to pull memories out of my head that I committed to memory 20 years ago is kind of hard, because case design and manufacturing, even the process of building cases, has changed. There's no similarities almost, other than the standards, the materials, and the methods over all those years have changed. It's almost impossible to find anything that's the same. Overall, I think that this case is pretty well executed, and for $65 for an MATX case with a similar footprint to an NR200P, I don't see what could possibly be wrong with this case other than the other thing, which is availability. I'm not sure where you can buy the BX mesh. And that to me is a little bit disappointing, because like I said, Chieftech has been around for such a long time, and in order for them to make a comeback, you're gonna have to actually be able to buy this case. So yeah, there is that too. Especially in Australia, I don't think you can buy this case anywhere in Australia. And that makes me a little bit sad. But let's see what Chieftech brings to the table now, right? I'd be interested to see what they've got cooking, because this is an impressive little case. Again, especially for $65. I like it, guys. I really, really like it. And I think you guys are gonna like it too. I've been Nick, this is Gear Seekers, you pick, we seek, and MATX is feeling really good at the moment, ladies and gents, and it's really good to see more MATX cases. Let's hope we see even more interesting MATX cases over the next year, or longer, however long I keep doing this YouTube thing. Thanks for watching. I don't know what the future holds, who knows? Maybe I'll get over it one day. Or maybe I'll drink my lukewarm coffee out of my floral coffee mug.